Kristen Kucsma, who we met at an Eastern Economic Association meeting a couple of years ago. She's formerly an award-winning professor at Seton Hall University, currently consulting for the New York Federal Reserve. Wow. Bear Stearns and a number of small private firms. She's president and CEO of a nonprofit organization, the Jeff Kucsma Memorial Fund, aimed at promoting economic literacy. And that's what she's going to talk about. So please welcome Professor Kristen Kucsma.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully we'll get this to work. I did bring some handouts, but I did not anticipate such a large group. I'm thrilled there's such a large crowd, but I brought 10 handouts with me. Anyways, I met Stephen, as he mentioned, a couple of years ago at the Eastern Economic Association conference in Philadelphia, and interestingly enough, I was there actually hosting a panel discussion of undergraduate students, and they were talking about, among other things, tax reform in the United States. And Stephen overheard some of this presentation and was, I think, at least mildly surprised by the really broad array of opinion that we had among the students there. We seemed to do a pretty good job at making sure that all of the different sides of the issue were well represented. And he and I got into a discussion about what I feel is something that is incredibly important in the classroom and unfortunately I think somewhat lacking in college classrooms. And that's really the need to present issues in a very objective, sort of unbiased way, particularly at introductory levels. So students can really digest the mechanics and the details of models and theories before forming some sort of informed opinion about what's right and what's wrong. So anyway, Stephen asked me to come here and really talk about how we might be able to educate in this way. And I thought that a good place to start would be to talk just a little bit about what I think the main objective of education is. And then from there, I thought I'd give you just a couple of examples of some of the ways that I at least attempt to introduce students to issues of monetary reform, but in a way that I hope in the long run is more effective in promoting some sort of maybe political involvement and civic mindedness on their part. Well, I'll get started and hopefully my PowerPoint presentation will catch up. Is it, no? Oh, it has to turn on. Okay. Anyways, as you'll hopefully see in a few minutes, the title of my presentation is actually Educator as Freedom Fighter. And that should make some more sense to you in just a few minutes. But when we think about the word to educate, I always like to start by going back and looking at really the Latin root for to educate, which of course is educare, and which really means to lead forth. And I like that as an educator. To lead, of course, I think reminds us as educators of the importance of our role as role models, really, for our students. We're not supposed to push them, but hopefully inspire them and lead them. And of course, the fourth part of that reminds us that there really should be some sort of forward motion, I think, in education. And it shouldn't be something static, but it should really be a dynamic process that we hopefully engage the students in. Now, from that point on, to lead forth is awfully broad. And there, of course, have been debates for decades. They continue today in schools of education about what the main requirements of a teacher should be and what core competencies we should be developing in the classroom. And you read various mission statements of colleges and universities. But what I like to do when I think of education is sort of boil it down to two different but related issues. One is I like to think of education, the main goal of education, as one of promoting freedom. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. The other is I like to think about education, one of the goals being to encourage student activism. Now, I think the question really then becomes for us as educators how to weight those two things. I like to think that I promote freedom of thought, among other things, among my students. And I also hope that I encourage them to really get involved in the real world around them, and obviously to get involved in things like issues of monetary reform. As I said, I think the question is how to weight the two. A significant concern that I've had over the last couple of years as an economics professor, I've become increasingly concerned at least in some college campuses, that the encouragement of student participation has been weighted too heavily. And I have been very involved throughout the years with students in terms of being advisor to the economics club, creating programs for them. When my dad died, I actually started a memorial fund in his honor, and most of the board of directors includes former students of mine. So I don't really want to downplay the importance of encouraging civic mindedness among students. My concern, though, as I said, is twofold. Number one, that we perhaps place too much weight on that, which leaves us with not enough time, not enough resources devoted to the promotion of freedom. I also am concerned that sometimes we encourage the civic participation too early. I think the promotion of freedom really is a necessary prerequisite to civic mindedness, and I'd like to see that encouraged and promoted first, and then I think that students will be much better informed and much more passionate when they ultimately become a little bit more involved in things, political movements, for example, like monetary reform. Obviously, student activism is very important. It's nothing new. One of the things that I liked when Reed mentioned before, of course, that any discussion of monetary reform has sort of been verboten since the early 1900s. That's true. Student activism, though, has been around for a long time. The American student movement really sort of flowered, if you will, during the 1930s, when the National Student League and the Student League for Industrial Democracy merged and formed the American Student Union. They were incredibly, incredibly active. What's interesting is during the 1930s, they were actually able to mobilize 500,000 undergraduates, which at that time was half of the undergraduate student body in this country. So it was an enormous force. That obviously ultimately then led to the student movements in the 1960s. And again, as we all know, these are very, very important because they did give rise to some very significant social and political change. Having said that, though, my concern again is that a lot of student activism today is not as well informed and as well grounded as it could be. I think a lot of students, we were all undergraduates at one time, and it's fun to fight for a cause and to get involved, and I love that. And I've been very fortunate throughout my teaching career that I had a number of fantastic students that thought my cause in terms of promoting economic literacy through my dad's memorial fund was worthy. And they worked tirelessly to help me raise money and to promote the fund and to help award scholarships. So I'm really happy that students have that sort of enthusiasm. What I'd like to see, though, is I'd like to see students really choose their projects, if you will, in a way that's very consistent with their own set of values and for a reason. And for that reason, I think that really our number one role as educators needs to be to promote freedom really among our students. Now, as soon as I say that, of course, we need to define freedom. So we open up another can of worms. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. There have been various definitions of freedom. I think the most general sense of freedom, when we all talk about freedom, is one that we associate with both classic liberals and neoliberals, really the ability to act without restraint from the government. That's sort of our knee-jerk, our initial reaction when we talk about having freedom here in the United States. But that general sense of freedom, I'm not sure that gets at what I think about as freedom as an educator. There's political freedom. Political freedom, we're all used to talking about, of course, and again, that's the lack of interference from the government, particularly when it comes to things like speech, religious practice, the press, and we all think that that type of freedom is very important. There's also economic freedom, and of course, Milton Friedman talked a lot about economic freedom. This is very consistent, of course, with the free market philosophy. The idea that markets should be allowed to really to operate unfettered by any sort of government interference. Really, it sort of generates the idea that individual economic agents should be free to use their resources, as they see fit. Now, there is one other type of freedom, though, that hasn't found its way into the literature much. Amartya Sen actually is one economist who did spend a lot of time talking about this, and that's this sort of notion of philosophical freedom. And philosophical freedom really can be broken down into two branches, and Isaiah Berlin is one of my favorites when I think about philosophical freedom in this sense, and he talks a lot about two different types of freedom. The freedom from something, which he calls negative freedom. So, for example, the freedom from oppression, and that's very important for individuals. And he also emphasizes the freedom to do something. So, for example, the freedom to recognize one's potential, and he calls that positive freedom. This is the type of freedom, if you pay close attention, that you'll hear people talking about when they talk about some sort of universal declaration of human rights and things like that. So really, if we think about this philosophical freedom, we break it down into two areas: the absence of some sorts of restraint, but the second one that I think is of significant importance to us as teachers is the development of some sort of inner autonomy, which is really what Isaiah Berlin calls it. And this is what students need to have so they can successfully develop their own potential. And what I'm talking about when I talk about inner autonomy, there are all kinds of different ways we can describe this, but I'm really thinking about students' ability to identify with their sort of inner self, to develop some sort of moral compass, if you will, so that ultimately then when they use the dictates of reason and they use all the wonderful things that we teach them in the classroom to go forward and to vote or to get involved with things like monetary reform, they're making these decisions based on some sort of individual inner truth, something that really fits with their own moral compass, their own inner set of values there, and in some cases even with some sort of universal set of values that they've determined fits with their own personal set of values. So the question then really becomes, how can educators foster this sort of philosophical freedom? And it's not easy, all right? There's been a lot of discussion on college campuses over the last 5 or 10 years about the integration of experiential education, reflection courses. So there's been a lot of discussion about how to help students achieve this sort of inner autonomy. As I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation, though, I get a little nervous sometimes, though, that having students reflect or engage in these experiential education exercises too early doesn't allow them to really form well-informed decisions. And I think what happens very often is students ultimately end up as new graduates, and they suddenly completely question everything that they learned as an undergraduate because they adopted points of view as undergraduates that fantastic, all right, that they hadn't really thought about. So just a sort of general answer to the question of how educators can foster philosophical freedom, I think the most important thing we can do is remain very comprehensive, very thorough, and very unbiased in the classroom, particularly at lower level introductory courses. I happen to be one of those professors that I'm not sure that a really in-depth discussion of the pros and cons of centrally planned economies versus free market economies, I'm not sure that's best suited in a micro-principles class. I'm just not. I'm not sure that a really in-depth discussion about the pros and cons or a classical school of thought versus Keynesian school of thought, or the pros and cons of having a central bank, for example. Again, I'm not sure those discussions should take place in an introductory level course. Why not? Well, as Reed mentioned before, when you talk about the need for a central bank, it's important to understand how the banking system operates. It's important to understand the implications of a 100% reserve requirement. And a day or two in money and banking or in principles of macro is not going to give students really a technical enough understanding of the system. Now, the other thing I think we can do to help provide a very comprehensive and unbiased picture is I think we need to provide students with a historical perspective. And I know that several people alluded to this before. I am an economic historian by trade, and I think this is incredibly important. I think it's really very necessary to emphasize the evolution of the discipline. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think we could save ourselves a lot of time and valuable resources if we looked back at discussions that have already taken place rather than sort of reinvent the wheel all over again. But also, I think it's very important to place things in this sort of historical perspective because this is the closest thing we have to a real-world experiment. So if we really want to get a sense of, for example, what would the world be like or what would the United States be like without a central bank, well, let's look back in history and take a look at previous periods where there was no central bank, or there was a sort of quasi-pseudo-central bank. And let's look back very objectively and just see what the experiences were there, and then we can go forward in an upper level class, for example, maybe in a seminar, and have a real in-depth discussion about the pros and cons and whether we would be better off now as a country without a central bank like the Federal Reserve. So I talk about something I call institutional evolution. Here we go. And as I said, I really think that this should be really a necessary component of certainly at least the introductory level classes, principles of micro, macro, money and banking. The problem with the institutional evolution is that for the most part, there are a few universities out there that do it fabulously well, but for the most part, most colleges and universities don't do a good job at this at all. I have a lot of experience working on AACSB accreditation and a lot of other university policies. I worked on the Middle States accreditation when I was at Seton Hall University, so I had the opportunity to do a lot of surveys and really research a lot of this at colleges and universities around the country. And I found really two things. Number one, when you look at business schools, first of all, the AACSB defines a list of core competencies: critical thinking, the adoption of technology in the classroom, teamwork. Nowhere in there is there any mention of providing a historical perspective to students or emphasizing any sort of institutional evolution. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't find a history requirement in business schools. You do, of course. Every business curriculum has a requirement, but it's usually thrown in there as part of your liberal arts core requirements, and the motivation usually is, well, you know, business students have to have, just a little bit of a liberal arts background, so we'll just make them take a history course, make them take an English course. But the emphasis really isn't on the importance of history as a tool in business. And one thing that's very interesting, just had a meeting last week with several managing directors at Bear Stearns, and both of them really echoed the sentiment that they wish that students had, or their new hires, had a much better sense of history. So that when we're talking about things like the repeal of Glass-Steagall, you understand why that debate was so significant. You understand why that act was passed in the first place, what the implications were, why it was a good idea or not to repeal it ultimately. So I've heard from a shockingly large number of business practitioners that say, God, why don't you guys teach business history in your business schools? And we're not doing it. Now, even in liberal arts colleges, which of course emphasize history more, but you still don't see a very strong development of the evolution of business practices. And I know that economics is a social science. I beat that into the heads of my students. But nonetheless, on many liberal arts colleges, it's seen as the one quote-unquote sort of business-related discipline. And there are very few courses, again, that really emphasize the institutional evolution or financial history, for example, on liberal arts colleges. Putting things in historical perspective, as I mentioned to you earlier, provides us with real-world experiments. As economists, we love that. It also helps us understand why we adopted current institutions in the first place, and it tells us whom to quote-unquote blame if we feel that there's some sort of blame that needs to be parceled out. The next slide here I just put up here before I talk to you a little bit about how I think we can emphasize this institutional evolution in the classroom. And I just like this because I think that this really sums up my feeling about education and the reason I think that we've got to find a way to educate our students better. And one of the things I find interesting about this quote, of course, is it mentions our hopes for economic growth. And I think Stephen also alluded to this earlier, that it is absolutely vital that we have a well-educated, well-informed population. Not only because they'll obviously be more productive members of the labor force, but they will of course also be more educated voters. And my real concern is that if we don't start doing a better job at educating our young people, we're going to fall behind for a variety of different reasons. Productivity levels will drop, and also civic participation will drop as well. So how could we integrate the historical perspective to foster philosophical freedom? There are a lot of different examples, but since I'm here speaking in front of all of you for the American Monetary Institute, I decided to choose two examples that were related to monetary issues. The first one, I think, obviously, there's a current debate over who should control the money supply. When I teach money and banking, I don't tell students what the pros and cons are of having the Fed versus not having the Fed. What I try to do, though, is get them to think outside of the box. And this is one of the things that Stephen and I talked about quite a while ago. I find it really interesting that a lot of today's undergraduates, and I guess we all do this, it's easy to think that the way things are now is the way they've always been. It's probably the best way just because that's the way it is, right? Because why would we adopt something if it's not the best way? And one of the things I always find really interesting when I teach money in banking and I go back, several hundred years, students have the toughest time imagining the United States without a Fed. They can't do it. They go, what? I say, when do you think the Federal Reserve System came into practice? Oh, 1780, they say, 1800. I mean, obviously, it must have been here as long as the United States has been a nation. And they're always somewhat shocked to find that the Federal Reserve System didn't come on the scene, of course, until 1913. And they're somewhat surprised to see that the bulk of the Industrial Revolution, depending on when you want to date its origins here, the bulk of the Industrial Revolution, of course, took place before we had a central bank like the Fed. And they can't wrap their hands around this. So I asked them to think a little bit about some other ways that money might be created. And this is all we do. We have a general discussion about alternative ways that money might be created. We don't talk about what's good, what's bad, whether the Fed is a good institution or a bad institution. We just think about different individuals and institutions that might create money instead of the Fed. So one of the things I do with them, and this is a very, very rudimentary set of graphs here, but one of the things I do is we sort of flash back to the Middle Ages. We flash back to medieval Europe when we had many private bankers and private mints that were taking, of course, for this discussion, we'll say gold bullion and turning it into coins. And we have a discussion of what commodity money regimes were like. And we have a discussion, of course, about the duality of commodity money and about the fact that private bankers in that case had a decision. They could use the gold as a commodity, for example. We could use it for something like earrings or jewelry. Or, of course, the bankers could take it and convert it into coins. Now, obviously, the bankers are going to be profit maximizing in this case. If people don't really have any particular interest in taking their gold bullion and having it turned into coins, if for some reason, for example, people don't feel the benefits of having some sort of quasi-uniform medium of exchange outweighs the cost of schlepping off to the mint and having the bullion converted into coins, there will be a low demand for coins. And obviously the seigniorage fee, or the price that the mints can charge people to convert their bullion into coin, is going to be low. It won't be profitable for the private mints to convert bullion into coin. They won't, and they'll be making lots of gold jewelry, or they'll be making lots of forks and knives and plates and cups. If, on the other hand, and this is one of the things that we saw during the Middle Ages, or actually right after the Middle Ages, if, on the other hand, the demand for some sort of convenient medium of exchange rises, perhaps because of a growth in international trade, an increase in the population, we would expect to see an increase in the demand for coin. The bankers would say, wow, I can charge a higher seigniorage fee. I can charge a higher price to anyone who comes in and asks me to make them a coin. There will be an incentive for them to increase the quantity supplied of coin, and poof, we'll have what's loosely speaking equivalent to an increase in the money supply. So there is a mechanism, at least in a commodity money regime like this, whereby market incentives would encourage private bankers to convert bullion into coin and, in essence, create money. So that's just one example of a discussion that we might have in class. We also, of course, have a discussion of early banks in the United States. So we have a discussion of how early banks operated by, of course, collecting specie and then issuing paper banknotes. And I think it was Reed that mentioned earlier, sadly enough, I think that the average college graduate in this country, actually probably the average person in this country, has absolutely no concept of how paper money is created. Now you say, of course they do, because you teach money in banking and you go through and you make your little T accounts with Bank A and Bank B, and you show the students how Bank A takes $1,000 of currency and sets aside the reserve requirement and issues checks. And we all have a discussion about how by loaning out those reserves and issuing checks, new money is created. And we all teach them a simple money multiplier, right, of 1 over the reserve requirement times the initial injection of money. And we say, wow, because of the multiple expansion of credit, we can take $1 million of reserves and turn it into $100 million of money. The students memorize the equation. You give them a couple of questions on the exam. They get it right. They can figure out what the money supply will be for a change in the reserve requirement. and they leave. But they really don't get it. Okay? They don't really understand what this new money is. And you know, for the first couple of years I was teaching, I couldn't figure out how to get this across to students. And then one day, this is not really a genius idea, and many of you probably do this, but one day I was sitting at my computer in my office and I said, you know what? What if I use the 30 people in my classroom as bankers? And what if I just print out some nice big, like $100 bills and $20 bills and pass them around to everybody? And I gave, you know, the person sitting all the way over here $1,000 in cash. And I said, here you go, I'm going to deposit my $1,000 with you. Set aside your $200, take your $800 here, and loan it out to somebody else. Oh, and incidentally, give me my $1,000 worth of checks so I can go write them out. And then I would say, all right, how much money is there right now? And say, what do you have over here? And Bob would say, oh, I have $800 cash that I just borrowed from Bank A. And I'd say, fantastic. I also happen to have $1,000 worth of checks in my pocket, which means you and I both right now could go to the mall and we could spend $1,800 right now. Now, obviously, once I write out the checks, we're going to have a problem. But again, the point is, they at least began to wrap their hands around the fact that, wow, as a result of this tiny step in the expansion of credit, wow, there's sort of like, kind of like fake money out there. Wait, there's really only $800 of cash out there. All right, there's the $200 sitting in the required reserves. But wait, we can spend $1,800? But you only printed up $1,000 there. So that's just another way that I really helped students wrap their hands around this expansion of credit. And I really think, as I mentioned earlier, that before we have these discussions about who should control the money supply, I think we really need to make sure that students really understand the different players that could conceivably increase the money supply. And certainly for contemporary times, they really need to understand how we create paper currency in this country. Oh, okay, you want me to be quiet? I just had one other quick little example before I leave you all, and that is just another current debate, of course, right now is over subprime lending. And I will just leave you with this thought on that as well. Obviously, right now, there's a great concern about the subprime lenders. And there are many people, right, that feel that many of the subprime lenders are sort of crooks. They're bad guys. I think nefarious was a word that was thrown out there before, and maybe not just about subprime lenders. But there's some concern that they use some predatory lending practices, and they really sort of tricked people into taking out some of these loans that they to either refinance homes or to purchase homes, loans that they ultimately couldn't afford to pay back. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. You know, that's really up to you to decide which side of the coin you're on there. But one of the things I find very interesting, my dissertation research was about the evolution of mutual savings banks in the United States in the 19th century. And what you see here, this is not really the greatest graph, but what you see here, you see that the mutual savings bank industry really hit its heyday in this country in the 1870s. But what's very interesting about mutual savings banks is that their origin was very philanthropic in origin. And the reason I throw this example up here is because I think we need to be a little bit careful when we evaluate the subprime industry. I think it's too easy right now for young people. I could have my students pick up the Wall Street Journal or flip on CNBC. They will probably hate subprime lenders after they do that. That might not be a bad thing, but I think my concern, though, is that there are some benefits of having subprime lenders. They fill certain needs for certain people. Maybe they didn't go about it quite the right way. But the nice thing about drawing the parallel between the mutual savings bank industry and the subprime lenders is that you can at least, again, think of a world where at least part of banks' motivation might be philanthropic. Now, just to finish up here, unfortunately, with mutual savings banks, they started off with very philanthropic motives. And then after the Civil War, they kind of switched over and became very profiteering. And that ultimately did contribute to the demise of the mutual savings bank industry. So maybe subprime lenders want to use that as a little lesson. But nonetheless, again, it gives us an opportunity to at least think of a possibility that at least there's some good, some social good that might come out of subprime lenders. Thank you.